On a warm Tuesday afternoon, the sun was high above the tree-lined road that stretched behind a busy gas station. Cars rolled in and out of the fuel lanes while people moved quickly, trying to beat the afternoon rush. Near pump number 4, a silver car sat quietly, its engine ticking from the heat. Beside it stood a woman in military camouflage, calm and steady, holding a bottle of water she had just bought inside the store. Her name was Sergeant Maya Johnson. She had just returned from a long National Guard drill and had stopped to grab a drink before heading home. Maya was used to being in control, trained to stay level-headed in high-pressure situations. Her posture was straight, her expression focused but peaceful. She was looking down at her phone, reading a message from her unit, when she heard the sharp voice behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Hands where we can see them." 2 police officers in Navy uniforms approached quickly, their steps firm. They didn't ask questions. They didn't check her ID. They didn't even look at her uniform properly. One of them reached for her arm as the other began to speak into his radio. Confused, Maya looked up and calmly asked what was going on. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," one officer said. "I'm active duty. I just left my drill site," she replied, holding up her military ID. But her words didn't matter. The officers didn't look at the card long enough to read it. Within seconds, they turned her around and placed handcuffs on her wrists. Her water bottle dropped to the pavement and rolled under her car. People nearby started to slow down. A woman pumping gas froze mid-motion. A man at the air pump pulled out his phone and began recording. Nobody said a word at first. The scene felt strange. The woman being handcuffed was calm, not resisting. Her uniform was clean and neat. She clearly didn't look like someone running from trouble. Maya kept her voice even. "This is a mistake. You need to call your supervisor." One of the officers scoffed. "We'll sort it out at the station." Even while restrained, Maya remained composed. Her training kicked in. She looked around and made eye contact with a teenager standing nearby. "Can you do me a favor?" she asked. "Call the Atlanta precinct. Ask for Captain Harris. Tell him Sergeant Maya Johnson is being detained at Midtown Fuel Station." The young man nodded and backed away with his phone already dialing. The gas station, once busy and noisy, had grown quiet. More people started watching. Some were filming. Others just looked confused, unsure of what they were seeing. Sergeant Maya Johnson stood silently between the 2 officers, her wrists bound, but her dignity untouched. She knew help was coming. What those officers didn't know was that the phone call being made would change everything. The gas station buzzed with tension. Engines hummed quietly, and the sound of wind rustled through the nearby trees, but most eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding near Pump 4. Sergeant Maya Johnson stood in her military camouflage, hands cuffed behind her back, surrounded by 2 police officers who didn't seem to realize who they were dealing with. The taller officer kept a hand near his radio while the other paced around, glancing at Maya's silver car. They seemed more focused on finishing the arrest than asking the right questions. They hadn't asked for her name again. They hadn't checked her ID. They hadn't called it in. Inside her head, Maya stayed calm, but she knew this was more than just a mistake. It felt like something deeper, a quiet assumption, a decision made too fast, without care. Meanwhile, the young man she had spoken to earlier, maybe 17 or 18 years old, was standing near a soda machine at the front of the gas station. He was on the phone, speaking quickly. "Yes, Captain Harris." She said her name is Sergeant Maya Johnson. She's at Midtown Fuel Station, and 2 officers have her in handcuffs. A pause. "Yes, sir. Right now." "Yes, she's in uniform." The captain's voice on the other end grew sharp. "Stay on the phone. Do not hang up. I'm sending someone immediately." Back at the pumps, Maya stood tall. She noticed more people filming with their phones now. A delivery driver in a blue truck parked nearby, shaking his head as he watched. A woman walking her dog had stopped at the corner, trying to understand what was going on. But the officers didn't seem to notice the crowd. One of them told Maya to sit on the curb. She didn't move. "You don't have the right," she said quietly. "You've made a mistake, and you're ignoring it." The officer looked frustrated. "We're doing our job." "Then do it right," she replied. Inside the gas station, the manager looked out the window nervously. Even though he hadn't seen the beginning of the situation, something didn't feel right to him either. He picked up his landline and called the non-emergency police number. Outside, the boy was still on the phone. "Yes, she's still here. She's calm, but they won't listen. Please hurry." Maya could hear him. She gave him a small nod. Not of thanks, but of understanding. It meant something to her that someone believed her, even if the officers didn't. The officer with the radio finally began to call in a report. His voice lacked urgency. "We've detained a female matching the description. No resistance. Yes, military-style clothing." The voice on the other end asked a question that made him pause. "What's her name?" He looked over at Maya. And for the first time, he asked, "What's your name again?" Maya raised an eyebrow. "Sergeant Maya Johnson, Atlanta Precinct, badge number 2471. The officer's expression began to change, just slightly, a crack in his certainty. Somewhere not far away, sirens began to wail. Help was on its way. The sun was high in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the gas station as people stood, watching in silence. The tension was thick, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. The officers were still standing near Sergeant Maya Johnson, though their demeanor had begun to shift. One of them, the taller officer, had now put his radio down, and he looked at Maya with a new kind of uncertainty in his eyes. He glanced at his partner, who was still fidgeting with his cuffs, but even he seemed uneasy now. Maya's eyes remained steady, her face calm, though inside she was running through the list of procedures. She was a seasoned officer herself, and she knew that this wasn't just a mistake. It was something deeper, something that had made her, a fellow officer in uniform, a target of suspicion for no other reason than the color of her skin. The crowd around the pumps was growing, but nobody said anything. The gas station had become a place of quiet curiosity. People recorded the scene on their phones, some shaking their heads, others simply watching. Maya could feel the stares, but she didn't let them shake her. She had been through enough to know how to stay in control. The younger man who had made the call stood nearby, nervously tapping his foot. He was still on the phone with Captain Harris, who had promised to send someone immediately. Maya could hear snippets of the conversation. "Yes, sir. She's still here. I think something's wrong. They're not listening." Just as the young man finished the call, another squad car pulled into the gas station. The sirens cut through the air, sharp and urgent. It was clear that this wasn't a routine call. Something was happening. The officer with the radio looked up, and for the first time, his expression shifted from irritation to realization. He turned to his partner. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered. The second officer, who had been a little more aggressive earlier, stopped in his tracks. He looked back at Maya, then at the approaching squad car. Maya could see the hesitation in his eyes, the doubt creeping in. It was too late to turn back now, though. Captain Harris had already been notified, and the situation was about to escalate in a way they hadn't expected. The new squad car rolled to a stop just behind the officers. Two more police officers got out, their faces serious, not wasting any time. They didn't even look at the officers who had detained Maya at first. Instead, their focus was entirely on the woman standing between the patrol cars. Captain Harris arrived in the second car. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a look of authority that made the atmosphere even more tense. Maya didn't say anything as he walked toward her. She knew what was coming. The two officers who had detained Maya shifted nervously as Captain Harris stood before them. His eyes moved from them to Maya and back again. "Uncuff her," Harris said, his voice calm but firm. "Right now." The officers hesitated, but only for a moment. They complied, removing the handcuffs from Maya's wrists. The crowd watched in silence, the murmurs growing as the tension in the air began to shift. Captain Harris turned to the two officers. "You're both suspended. Effective immediately." The words were sharp, like a command that left no room for argument. Maya stood still, taking in a deep breath as the handcuffs were finally removed. The weight that had been pressing on her wrists was gone, but the weight of the situation lingered. Now it was clear the wrong had been done, and someone was going to answer for it. The crowd around the gas station was still and quiet, almost as if the air had become thick with a mix of confusion and anticipation. As Captain Harris stood before the two officers, Sergeant Maya Johnson's wrists were finally free. She didn't flinch, didn't rush to rub her wrists. Instead, she stood tall and steady, looking at the captain as if she'd been waiting for this moment to come. Her calmness stood in sharp contrast to the tension surrounding them. The officers who had detained her stood with their heads down. The taller one shifted his feet nervously, while the other fiddled with his hands behind his back. They clearly hadn't expected this. They had no idea that their actions, so quick and unthinking, would lead them to this point. Their mistake had been more than just a minor error. It had exposed something deeper, a flaw in the way they saw and reacted to the world around them. Captain Harris looked at them, his voice even but firm. "You two need to step aside." Without waiting for a response, he turned to Maya. His eyes softened just a little. "Sergeant, are you all right?" Maya nodded, though she didn't speak at first. Her gaze was steady, but her mind was processing everything. The rush of emotions, the shock, and the deep disappointment in how quickly she'd been judged. But there was also a quiet relief. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the larger issue, the way people in positions of power often fail to see the bigger picture. The younger man who had made the phone call was standing nearby, still holding his phone, staring at the officers with disbelief. He had done the right thing. And now, it seemed that things were finally beginning to settle. Maya turned to him and gave a brief, appreciative nod. It wasn't a thank you, but it was an acknowledgement of what he had done. "I'm sorry, Mom," the younger officer, who had been more vocal in his actions, muttered quietly. His voice was laced with discomfort, perhaps guilt. "We didn't know." Captain Harris didn't let him finish. "You should have known," he said bluntly, before turning his attention back to Maya. "You're free to go," Harris said, his tone changing to something less stern and more understanding. Maya hesitated, but owned it for a moment. She gave a slow nod and stepped away from the officers who had held her. The handcuffs were gone, but the weight of what had just happened was still heavy in the air. She had learned something today, that even when you're part of the system, you can still become its victim. And for a moment, Maya had been treated not as a respected officer, but as someone to be questioned and detained without reason. As Maya turned to leave, the crowd began to murmur among themselves. The tension in the air began to break. People exchanged glances, some nodding in approval, others still shaken by what they had witnessed. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Captain Harris walked away, his phone in hand, he began making more calls. This was far from finished. The department would have to answer for what had just happened. The officers involved would have to face the consequences of their actions. And Maya, as she walked toward her car, knew that she had just become part of something bigger. Her quiet strength had made a statement, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been unfairly judged or wrongfully treated. She would make sure that her voice, and the voices of those who had been silenced, would be heard. The crowd at the gas station began to disperse, but the buzz of what had just happened lingered in the air. Some people exchanged quiet words with each other, still trying to make sense of what they had seen. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the weight of the incident had not quite left yet. Maya Johnson, standing by her silver car, took a deep breath and glanced around. The handcuffs were gone, but the anger and confusion from the moment weren't so easily forgotten. Captain Harris stood nearby, speaking into his phone, his tone serious. Maya could hear snippets of this conversation, though she didn't try to catch every word. She didn't need to. She knew that things were already set in motion. What had happened to her couldn't be overlooked. Not by him, not by anyone. The two officers who had detained her, now standing at a distance, were no longer in control of the situation. They had made their choice, and it had backfired. The younger officer, the one who had been more nervous throughout, was now looking down at the ground, his face flushed with embarrassment. His partner, however, was standing with his arms crossed, still trying to act like everything was normal. But it wasn't. Nothing about this was normal. Maya didn't want to linger any longer. She knew the moment she stepped into her car, she would leave the gas station behind. But it wasn't just the location that she wanted to leave. She wanted to leave behind the thoughts of unfairness, the sense of being judged not by her actions, but by the way others saw her. "Sergeant, can I speak with you for a moment?" Captain Harris called, walking over to Maya. His voice was calm, his expression a mix of concern and professionalism. Maya turned, meeting his gaze. "What's going to happen now?" she asked. Harris paused for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "We'll get to the bottom of this. You have my word." He paused again, then added, "What happened here isn't acceptable. We'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Maya nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude. Though it wasn't enough to wipe away the sting of the past few hours, she appreciated his words, but she knew this was just the beginning. The process would be slow, and she would have to make sure that this didn't become just another story that faded with time. The younger man who had made the phone call earlier was walking toward her, a hesitant look on his face. He held up his phone. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm glad you're okay." Maya smiled faintly, not because she found it amusing, but because she was grateful for his courage. "Thank you," she said quietly, then added, "We all have a part to play in making things right." She gave him a brief nod before getting into her car. The engine started with a soft hum, and for a moment, she sat there, staring out the window. She had been shaken, but she had also been heard. The wrong had been acknowledged. And now, as she drove away from the gas station, she knew that the fight for fairness wasn't over. But it had started with a single moment of recognition, one that would not be easily forgotten. The road ahead was uncertain, but Maya Johnson had learned something valuable. Sometimes, even the smallest voice can make a difference. As Maya Johnson drove away from the gas station, the city around her felt strangely distant. The streets were bustling with life, but her mind was focused on what had just happened. The situation at the gas station wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of something much bigger, something that too many people had faced, but few were willing to address. Maya's thoughts were heavy, but she knew this wasn't the time to dwell on the anger. Not yet. There was still a lot of work to be done. The road was familiar, but today it seemed different. Maya's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as she drove through the streets she knew so well. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a text notification lighting up the screen. She reached over and glanced at it. It was from her best friend, Carla. "You good?" Maya paused for a second before typing a quick response. "I'm fine. Just a long day." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The truth was, she wasn't sure how she felt. Part of her was relieved that the officers had been held accountable. Part of her was angry that it had to come to that in the first place. And another part of her, a quieter part, was exhausted, tired of fighting battles that should never have needed to be fought. As she continued driving, Maya turned the corner onto her street, where rows of houses lined the way. She slowed down as she passed a small park on the left, the swings set gently swaying in the breeze. She used to play there as a child. The sound of laughter and the feeling of freedom, a far cry from the reality she faced today. But those memories now seemed so distant, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who didn't have to carry the weight of a world that often misunderstood her. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call. It was Captain Harris. Maya answered with a deep breath. "Sergeant," Harris said on the other end, his voice steady. "I just wanted to check in and make sure you're doing okay. We've started an internal review of the situation. Those officers will be held accountable, and I'm pushing for more training in how we handle these types of situations." Maya was silent for a moment, letting the words sink in. Accountability. That was what she needed to hear. But even then, she wasn't sure it would be enough to change things in the long run. "Thank you, Captain," she finally said. "But I don't want this to stop here. There needs to be a bigger change. This is about more than just me." "I understand," Harris replied, his voice softening. "We're working on it. We'll get there, Sergeant." After a short pause, Maya ended the call and sat for a moment in her car, parked in front of her house. The lights in her windows were on, a sign that her family was home. Maya got out of the car and made her way inside, her footsteps slow, as if her body knew what her mind hadn't fully grasped yet, that this was only the beginning. As she entered her home, her brother, Darren, was sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner. He looked up at her with a raised eyebrow, sensing something wasn't quite right. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Maya smiled faintly, nodding. "Yeah, just a long day." But inside, she knew that the day wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The battle for justice and equality was far from finished, and Maya was ready to face whatever came next. The next few days felt like a blur for Maya. The incident at the gas station had stirred something deep within her, something she couldn't easily shake off. Every time she stepped outside, she felt as though the eyes of the world were on her. She had been a police officer for years, but now she couldn't help but wonder, how many times had she been judged or misunderstood without anyone ever speaking up? Her phone rang early one morning, and Maya picked it up, knowing it was probably something related to the investigation. It was Captain Harris again. "Sergeant, we've completed the internal review," he said, his voice serious. "The 2 officers involved have been suspended, and we're pushing for them to face further disciplinary actions. We're also launching a department-wide training program on bias and racial profiling. This is bigger than just this incident." Maya sat up straighter, her fingers curling around the phone. "I appreciate the efforts, Captain, but will this training make a real difference? Will it change the way people think?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "It's a start," Harris replied. "I can't promise that it will change everything overnight, but we're making the first step. We're holding people accountable, and we're changing the way we approach these situations." Maya didn't respond right away. A start. That was all she had ever heard. How many times had she heard promises that didn't lead anywhere? She didn't want to be a part of a system that simply started things but never saw them through. "I want to be involved in the training," Maya said, her voice firm. "I want to make sure it's not just words, but real change." "Understood," Captain Harris replied. "We'll make sure your voice is heard." As the conversation ended, Maya felt a sense of resolve growing inside her. Change would never be easy, but it had to start somewhere. It might not come quickly, and it might not come in the way she expected, but she was determined to be a part of it. A few days later, Maya attended a department meeting where she was asked to speak about her experience. As she stood in front of her fellow officers, she could feel their eyes on her. Some were sympathetic, others uncomfortable, but all were listening. She took a deep breath before speaking. "What happened to me at that gas station wasn't just about me," Maya began, her voice calm but unwavering. "It's about all of us. It's about how we see people, how we respond when we're faced with something that's different. I've spent my entire career trying to do things the right way, but we have to be honest with ourselves. If we don't address the bigger issues, if we don't recognize the biases we carry, we'll never change." She paused, letting her words settle in the room. "I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm here because I want to make a difference. For all of us, we have to do better." The room was silent for a moment before one of the older officers spoke up. "You're right, Sergeant," he said slowly. "This isn't just about you. It's about all of us. And maybe Maybe we've been blind to it." Maya nodded, grateful for his words, but also aware that this was only the beginning. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. Things could change. She had to believe that. Weeks passed after Maya's meeting, and slowly, the changes she had hoped for began to take shape. The department-wide training on bias and racial profiling was rolling out, and Maya was actively involved in shaping the curriculum. She spent hours with experts, discussing how to identify unconscious biases, how to treat everyone with respect, and how to respond thoughtfully in situations that might otherwise escalate. Though Maya still faced challenges within the department, there were moments when she felt a sense of hope. It wasn't perfect, and the process was slow, but the fact that the conversation had started meant something. The officers who had once treated her with suspicion were now coming to her for advice, seeking guidance on how to better handle situations they had once been too quick to judge. One afternoon, Maya sat down with a group of younger officers who had just completed the training. They were eager, wide-eyed, and ready to make a difference. Maya could see the sincerity in their expressions as they asked questions and discussed the challenges they would face on the job. Sergeant Johnson, one of them, asked, "How do we deal with situations like the one you went through at the gas station? How do we make sure something like that never happens again?" Maya leaned back in her chair, looking at each of them in turn. She knew that these were the officers who could make a real difference, who could change the system from within. It's about recognizing that people, no matter their background or appearance, deserve to be treated with dignity. Every situation is different, but the foundation is the same: fairness and respect. If you are unsure, take a step back, breathe, and ask yourself, am I responding because of what I see, or because of what I know to be true? The officers nodded thoughtfully, their expressions serious. Maya knew that, despite the obstacles, there were enough people like them who wanted to do better. It was a reminder that change could happen, even if it was one small step at a time. That evening, as Maya sat on her porch, she reflected on how far she had come. It had been a tough journey, one that had challenged her belief in the system she had dedicated her life to. But through it all, she had learned that it wasn't enough to simply follow the rules. Sometimes, you had to challenge them, to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were against you. She thought about the young man who had made the call that day at the gas station. He had been scared, unsure of what to do, but he had taken the right step. Maya hoped that the lessons he had learned in that moment would stay with him for the rest of his career. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya felt a sense of peace. There was still much to be done, but the road ahead didn't feel as daunting as it once had. She had made her voice heard, and now it was time to keep moving forward. One day at a time, one conversation at a time, one change at a time. And that was how real progress would be made. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool evening breeze wash over her. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she was no longer fighting it alone.